It is 7 o'clock, and we're going to be good about that and keep on time. So, welcome. We are back in our home here in Western Marble Arch, just above the synagogue. My name is Rabbi Daniel Epstein, and I'm here with Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who has been my conversation partner for these wonderful talks based on the book God's Unfailing Word, which is the book that is put together by the Church of England in around 2019 to talk about theological and practical perspectives on Christian-Jewish relations. We've had a couple of talks already. The first one was on chapters 1 and 2, A Difficult History and a Distinctive Relationship. And we got through some of the earliest ideas of Christianity and how it diverged and what the challenges were in diverging from Judaism. Last time, 2 weeks ago, we spoke about mission and evangelism and teaching and preaching. It was mostly mission and evangelism, a little bit of teaching and preaching. One of the most difficult, I think, topics for any type of sort of interfaith conversation between Christians and Jews is very much the idea of trying to bring one side over to the other rather than an open dialogue that stays with everybody staying where they are. And that's a challenge, and we spoke about it, and I think we addressed that in some parts, and some questions have come up. And tonight is going to be a very different type of conversation, I think. The chapters, the last 2 chapters in the book, and we're following the book itself, are the land of Israel, that is chapter 5, and then ethical discernment and common action. So land of Israel, a big topic we're going to get into both theologically and possibly politically a little bit and try and understand that. And because we are, as we said earlier, we're having this as a robust conversation, I've asked Reverend Sam to really give me a run for my money in terms of that. It's important so that we can have a proper conversation about Israel. And then when we get to the ethical discernment, the question is, where do we go next in terms of our relationship post Nostra Aetate and in general over the last 60, 70 years of conversation, or last 40, should I say, or 50 or 60 years of conversation, and how we're going to move forward and next steps maybe in how we have this conversation. Just some housekeeping rules. The first one is we'd ask you to put your questions and comments in the chat section. So as you hear things coming up, please do put your comments in the chat. Jonathan Evans, who will introduce himself in a moment, will explain that he'll check those for you and for us. And we're going to have this as an open conversation. It is not a debate as such, but rather a better way to understand how we approach these challenging topics, and the fact that we have created for ourselves a safe space in sense of we can have some tough conversations in the spirit of fellowship that myself and Sam have been very fortunate and blessed to develop over a number of years. Means that we can maybe take some questions out for a bit of a spin that we wouldn't normally be taking out with people we're just meeting for the first time. So I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Evans just to say hello for a couple of minutes so you know who he is, and then we will get started on our...
I'm Jonathan Evans. It's a pleasure to be with you and be involved in these sessions tonight. I'm the Associate Vicar for Heartedge at St Martin in the Fields, and I'll be looking out for your comments and questions as we go through this session. Do put them in the chat, and I'll be relaying them to Rabbi Daniel and to Sam towards the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to put us on the screen so we can just see how we're looking. But first of all, good evening.
Good evening. It's great to be here.
And it's lovely. And looking forward to this. It's been a very interesting series. And we're going to have to take some time to look back at what we've said and the things we've addressed and see how we're doing. And I wanted to actually start by explaining why I'm a little bit unkempt. It would look to be not as clean shaven as I was 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, in fact. And it's to do with, in fact, I think a little bit of what we're talking about today in some sense. We are in a period of the Jewish year known as the 3 weeks. Now, you could just pick any 3 if you want, but there's a specific 3 that are happening at the moment. We are about to get next week to the new month, the new lunar month, which is the 1st of Ab. And the month of Av is a very difficult month for the Jewish people. It is historically a month of tragedy and challenge and sadness. And I'll explain a little bit about why. And so a week ago on Sunday was the fast of the 17th of Tammuz. And it's the fast that marks the breaching of the walls of the old city of Jerusalem by the Babylonian and the Roman armies. And primarily for the Roman army, it was leading up to the destruction of the temple, which happened in the year 70 AD. And that destruction happened 3 weeks after the walls were breached. So in a national sense, we take on this 3 weeks, or many people who are, I guess, orthodox in that sense, and that this is something that's important in terms of not just the ritual, but a connection to the history, is that we start to show signs of mourning. And mourning itself is a sense of paying less attention to your physical appearance, letting things, as it were, just grow naturally. We're not looking to groom ourselves, but rather to just feel a sense of grief. Grief represents and manifests itself physically for many people. And so we start to grow our beards longer. For many rabbis who already have beards, it's not so obvious that that's what's happening. But for myself, who usually I'm usually clean shaven. So over the course of a 2 or 3 week period, my beard will grow in. And then the day after the 9th of Av, which is Sunday 2 weeks, is the saddest day in our Jewish calendar. And it's a day when we commemorate the destruction of the temple and the exile from Israel, which happened in 70 AD. And we spend the day, or part of the day, in prayer and in very much in a sense of mourning. We turn the lights off in our synagogue. We take off all of the beautiful covers on all the tables and on the front of the ark. We leave everything open and bare and naked in a sense. We sit on the floor. We do not sit on the pews. We sing dirges and lamentations, the book of Lamentations we read, Eicha. And it's a day which really is resonant with a national sense of mourning. And when you go to Israel, you see pictures live at the Western Wall. You'll see people doing the same thing. And it's only part of the Jewish community that does this, the more Orthodox. And you'll see people usually it's in the summer. It happens in the summer around August time, July, August. And there are people in Tel Aviv on the other side of Israel who are on the beach and have no real sense that that is the day that's happening. It is a real sense. I'm sure sometimes we have this in Christianity. Many people are devout and dedicated to a certain important day, and the rest of Christendom almost has no clue that it's happening. And you try to grapple with this. So this is my personal, as it were, what the word would be, display, as well as a national display of mourning. And the mourning starts lightly with a growth, then it moves into that day where we don't do certain activities. We don't put on phylacteries in the morning. We're too grief-stricken on the 9th of Ab, on the day of the destruction. And so we only put on our prayer boxes and say certain prayers in the afternoon, after symbolically the temple had already was burning, and now the burning had subsided somewhat, and therefore we can even engage with a chance to keep our commandments. So in contrast to personal grief, which starts very, very traumatically and suddenly, and then wanes over time as we come to terms with what we are facing, this national grief works in reverse. It starts quietly and comes up to a climax on the very last day of the 3 week period. And then for a day after that, we also take it, we relax our stringencies, and then we move into a more optimistic and hopeful part of our year. So this, in a sense, is my personal connection between both the theological, historical, and the modern state of Israel, because Israel to me is not just a country in terms of its geographical borders. It's a statement of what it means to be connected to that idea of covenant. And covenant was always given as both a promise by God for land and for children. So when we look through Genesis, for example, the covenants given to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob give 2 particular code words we're always looking for. And God says, I will give you Zerah, or Zaracha, your seed, and also the Adama, Asher Natati Lachem, which I have given to you, the land which I give to you. So whenever you see a promise between God and one of the forefathers, which includes land and children, that is, as it were, sort of a coded way to understand that this is a genuine promise and prophecy that God is presenting for our future covenant. So that's really a little bit of an introduction to the
Wonderful
combination between history, Israel as a country, Israel as an expression of a promise between God and the Jewish people. And so it's an interesting place to start.
Well, if we stay with Genesis 12, Israel is the descendants of Abraham, through whom all the nations will find a blessing. Would you say all the nations are finding a blessing through Israel right now?
It's a great question. So the phrase which we would quote is the Nivruchu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama, and through you will be blessed all the families of the earth, which is really interesting, and not goyei haaretz.
Okay.
So firstly, family, I think, is a key to that. And if family is not an understanding of our relationships, then the blessing is somewhat hampered. Israel, I think, is a challenge. In some ways, the challenge is to try and figure out, are we doing the best that we are supposed to in every instance? We could say that about every country. And in fact, we should say that about every country. And when we get into notions, for example, of anti-Semitism, the sense is that, are you being as honest and forthright about what you expect from every country's treatment of its policies and its citizens as you would for Israel itself? And if you're going to point the finger, then by all means point the finger on terms of objective facts that you can gather as much as you can, but then you would be expected to hold other countries to the same account, and therefore we all have responsibility.
Well, I think other countries that ask to be held to that account, as America clearly does. America sees itself as the city on the hill, as a democracy like no other, as a gift to the world. I'm not sure it did under the last regime, but it certainly does again now. Britain, for many years, certainly in the 19th century, saw itself as inheriting the promises made to Israel. I'm not sure every country in the world would think of itself in quite that way, but I think one of the issues with Israel is it does, to the extent that it sees itself as a theological project, it does hold itself to a high standard.
It's interesting. I think it holds itself as well, even before others are holding it to a very
I think this is about
disproportionately high standards.
So my question is not, what do you expect the Arab world or even a secular person in this country to think of the state of Israel? I think what does an Israeli think of Israel? What does a Jewish person in the diaspora think of Israel? Are you proud of Israel?
I'm very proud of Israel. I'm very proud of the steps that it's taking in its newer incarnation. If we're going to talk about 1948 onwards, then we're talking about a country that's just beyond its 70th birthday. And in 70 years, what has been achieved has been quite extraordinary. An ingathering of extraordinary number of people, technology that has developed at an unprecedented rate, a capacity to be involved and still maintain its democracy, which is incredibly messy, but very honest. For a country to be able to have 4 elections in 2 years and not descend into absolute civic disintegration.
Well, end up with a compromise like no other.
And now end up with a government which has really actually had one of its first real tests in the last week, which we'll talk about maybe in a few moments. But in terms of what it's had to deal with and the constant threat of war, it's not a case that Israel is ever really at peace. I think we always talk about this idea that Israel doesn't enjoy peace at the moment. It enjoys extended or less extended ceasefires. And it's been that way for even before 1948. Many riots that were happening a long time before, trying to grapple with its place. And I think that that's something that I'm incredibly proud of what it is achieving. And also the bilateral trade, for example, at £7+ billion just between Israel and England, which is more than the bilateral trade of all the other countries that surround Israel combined with Britain. So again, a real sense of understanding and appreciation of what we can do when we trade and we work together, which is again a real beacon for the whole region. It's integrated people from multiple areas. It's giving Israeli Arabs full citizenship and rights, even if they're challenging and difficult. And there are many other questions on top of that, whether they're theological, whether they're historical. But if you wanted to vote in an election, you can do so. If you want to have access to education and medical treatment, you can do so. And again, you could say that in certain parts of Israel, the education and some of the infrastructure is not as developed in some of the Arab Israeli towns as it is in the majority, let's say, Jewish Israeli towns. And the new coalition, in fact, one of the elements that the Ram party came in with, Mansour Abbas, coming into a broad coalition, was because he was promised and requested that a lot more budget and focus is given internally to those
A very
communities
pragmatic approach.
to help them move up. So it's not about the Israel-Palestine conflict. He's saying my focus really is to help these citizens who, like any other peripheral group in many countries, we could talk about, the people in beyond the Red Wall, which was, well, people feeling that they need a lot more investment in the north of England, in Scotland, in Wales, especially in Wales, than there's getting in the London-centric approach. Same thing, I think, in parallels is happening in Israel. So a lot of interesting things are happening, and maybe some places where there wasn't as much investment internally is being taken care of. But at the same time, there are huge political challenges with the region in itself, a lot of involvement of many other countries, many theologies, and many things. But I'm proud of what the country's achieved. I'm proud of the freedom of the holy sites and access that is given under the Israeli government and Israeli governance, and that is fantastic for all, especially Christians. And I think specifically, if we're talking about the Copts in Egypt and Christians in Syria and in Lebanon, and who I used to work for a Lebanese Christian here in London when I first started work, a software company run by a lovely man who was really, we had these conversations all day if I wasn't working on software. But again, to give freedom of expression and access to holy sites of the Christian faith in Israel is also, as it goes to our previous conversations, that we're comfortable with other people worshiping in their way and don't feel that there's a sense of undermining religion just because you worship in other ways. So I'm incredibly proud, despite the challenges that are presented, the things that have been achieved in those years are nothing short of actually extraordinary. And I think it's the pressure and the challenge and the almost impossible nature, coupled with this Jewish sense, I said, of just seeing that there's no sense of tragedy, there's always possibility, that we have to push and push. Is there more to be done? Well, I hope so. There's always more to be done, but the people who are most critical of more to be done are the Israelis.
So, I mean, we talked about America, and obviously it's a good day to talk about America because
Absolutely.
it's the 4th of July. But there's a paradox at the heart of America, and the paradox is more or less that America was founded by people who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe. And yet they developed this huge blind spot to the persecution that they imposed on people once they got to America, whether that was Native Americans, whether that was African Americans, as we now call the people that were once slaves. And that's that sense of oppression that people had coming from Europe seemed to take away, rather than enhance their sensitivity, seemed to take away their sensitivity to what they then did when they got to America. So there is an irony at the heart of the state of Israel, which is not 100% different, which is this is the people, perhaps of all people, most persecuted, most aware, you might think, of what it means to be a persecuted people, and yet they come to a land where the Palestinians are already living, and yet they struggle. I mean, I understand the hostility of the various wars that have happened from 1948 onwards, but notwithstanding all of those things, the Palestinians get a very raw deal, and particularly in relation to recent, in the last 20 years, or perhaps, perhaps particularly since the first Intifada, the world has come to understand the situation that many Palestinians find themselves in. And you'd think that Israel, of all nations, would be mindful of what it means to be an oppressed people. That seems to me the irony.
And I think it's a very interesting one. I think it's a very interesting idea that anybody who has been under persecution, again, you'd feel that in a sense they would have, you said, extra sensitivity. I think there is very much a sensitivity, and sometimes I think it's important to try and differentiate between the people who are living there, the political echelons who demand a certain narrative that they can keep maintaining on a multi-generational basis, and we'll look at this in a second, and the vast majority of the people who just want to live in peace on both sides, who just want to get on with being able to work. I think there are some challenges we need to face and face head on. And one of which is that in order to create a good, strong society, you need institutions that are built up in order to provide the necessary infrastructure for a country to grow. And we've all had it. Israel, the Jewish people were, as it were, nomadic in that sense from 70 AD until 1948 or 1947, when the partition plan was put forward. Again, it was a vote at the UN, which was the highest form of human rights at the time, asking each country to decide whether they thought it was a good idea to take this one block of land, which from a theological and biblical perspective was very much a part of the Jewish story and had been for 2,000 years and more, unbroken, and split it between the Jewish people who were looking for it and the Arab populations who were there, and trying to split in some way that was reasonably connected to where people were broadly living. So it wasn't about picking all these people up and put them over here and these people over here just because we decided these are the lines. This was where it would go. The majority of it would go, in fact, to the Arab League at the time, and the minority of the land actually would come to the new fledgling Jewish state, or fledgling Jewish state. Remember, there'd been a Jewish sovereignty there 1900 years before, and was successful until it also came under its own challenges. And the Jewish people immediately turned around and said, we'll take it, because anything we can take, we'll take. And the idea of the other side was no. And then we've constantly been trying to get to the table. And again, these are contentious discussions we can have, but we have plenty of evidence to say that it happened in 1948 and it happened in 1956 and 1967. The idea of the Six-Day War was to enable to expand a land for the purposes of then being able to turn around and sit down the following day and say, right, let's negotiate back, because that's how you work. It happened in California, happened in Louisiana. It happened in America, where they went and took over very large swathes of land, and it wasn't as pretty then, if we're talking about the parallel as well. And the idea was to try and have someone to give these back to, and constantly, over one after the other, different ideas, and open to the rest of the world, suggesting ideas, whether it was America, whether it was the Arab League, whether it was others, suggesting ways that we could find a way forward. Saudi Arabia of late, trying to come up with a plan to try and figure out how things were going to move forward. The plan of the century, which Trump was trying to put together. Like everything else, it would have been the plan of the century, but for whatever reason, it didn't quite pan out. But again, Israel being open and willing to say, you know what, if other people want to come in and try to suggest, we believe that the best way to do this is for us and the Palestinians to sit down and figure this out. But other people want to make suggestions, we are open to the suggestions. Camp David, whether it was Carter, whether it was Bush Senior, Bush Junior, Clinton, everybody. Eventually it was Rabin who managed to do it. And we've made peace with Egypt and given back huge swathes which we wanted to. Peace with Jordan. We'd make peace with Syria if we could. Peace with Lebanon. Again, Lebanon has its own internal challenges. And now peace into the Gulf. So Israel is not the people who are standing in the way of moving the entire experiment forward. And that, to me, is always a challenge when we have the conversations, is that yes, Israel does hold itself to a standard. Yes, there are lots of things that need to be taken care of, but we try to take care of them. And the last thing we want is to be responsible for people who should have their own national direction and be able to figure that out.
So in terms of the direction you think things should go, you haven't used the word Palestinian yet, but I assume that that's what you're referring to, that you would see potentially Gaza and the West Bank as being a country on Israel's borders.
It's a very difficult question to answer in many ways, and it's not just about not wanting to answer it. And that's where I think this is really an interesting place to have the conversation. It happens on multiple levels. The first level is very much at a biblical level, an idea of covenant, a country that was given in the Bible to the children of Israel in order to be able to inherit and to use as the basis for this extraordinary experiment called society, capital S, under God, which is what America tried to behave as. And in fact, Rabbi Lord Sachs of blessed memory would always get very excited at the inaugural speeches, at least until 2016. But he wanted to hear, and he was listening for those echoes, those moments, those quotes of the Bible that you knew, that it told the people who were taking on the mantle of leadership in America that they were inheriting this e pluribus unum, this idea of from out of the many comes one, this idea of in God we trust, this idea of we are an experiment, which is a divine experiment. That as long as we keep our divine relationships and we understand that God is part of everything we do, everybody has automatic freedom, they have inalienable rights, and then we will be able to move forward properly. But if you start to lose sight of that, then you're just like any other country, and then you can expect to find yourself in serious challenges like any other country that doesn't see itself as a divine experiment. Israel, I think, is also the same way. So from a biblical perspective, I believe that Israel, greater Israel, is for the children of Israel, for the people of Israel. At the same time, the rabbis, and another part we were discussing a couple of weeks ago, is that Judaism didn't stop in 70 AD when we were exiled from Israel. In fact, there were people who never actually left. So not the entire, they didn't go around and clean the entire country. They took a very large, mostly an elite, and also a working class. They could bring them down, whether it was at the time beforehand to Babylon, whether it was back to Rome. We know there are documents of Jewish slaves being used to build the Colosseum, and a lot of the interesting ideas. And again, you can look it up even on Wikipedia, while it still maintains its balance. Also, a lot of the riches that have come from Jerusalem have been used be able to contribute to the building of the Colosseum. So there are ideas, again, that this was where things were going. But what I'm saying is that the biblical element is that that's our land for us to be able to live correctly under God. What also happens is, as I said, since the year 70, and even beforehand, the Mishnah, the Talmud, these books of deep discussion, both on theological level, pragmatic level, legal level, and also in what we call Agadata, which is the story level of how things were going. We're trying to get to a sense of the importance of practical solutions to maintain peace, to maintain your safety, and to maintain an ability to understand that the land will only be yours if you behave a certain way. And the guarantee and connection to the land of Israel is not a given. I think that's also important. Like everything else in life, nothing's a given. You work as hard as you can for it. You work towards holding on to it with everything you can. But the Torah says itself, the land will spew out its inhabitants if they don't behave in a spiritual way that reflects the way the land should be looked after. And whenever I see that there's challenge about parts of the land being ceded, then I think it's, for me as well, it's a wake-up call as, are we doing everything we can to be able to look after our land? And at the same time, is there a safe way, which many of the rabbis who I hold in tremendous esteem over the course of time have said that if it comes to what they call land for peace, and if it's genuine peace that can be offered, then they are of the opinion that land can be given to someone else in order to make peace, and that would be our best way to guarantee that we can continue to live carefully. So Sinai is a classic example.
Right.
Many parts are classic examples much further. The biblical borders of Israel would be quite frightening if someone tried to draw them on a modern map. You just have to read through the Torah to understand. They go as high as they go as far north as Beirut and further. They go off towards the Euphrates pretty much.
Right. Well, the extent of lands, even under David, are pretty extensive, aren't they?
Right. So this is much smaller. So I think, in a sense, that yes, there's a challenge, but at the same time, practicality can win out, and there could possibly be a chance that there is options. But again, both sides have to try and come to it with a chance for genuine peace. And I think that what's happening, like many things in society, is people are pushing for rapid answers without having done a lot of the groundwork that's required to determine the best way to be.
Well, we certainly seem to have a situation where both sides have created a leadership on the other side. You know, that they've created each other's leadership, because they've pushed people like Netanyahu to one side, and then you've got obviously an emergent Palestinian leadership that you couldn't describe as moderate. But what about settlements then? What about settlements? Because you know, when I was spending quite a bit of time in Israel on the West Bank in the mid-1980s, it was a very different place from what it is now, because you've got all these settlements. Those settlements aren't going away.
So whether they do go away or don't, here's a classic example. This past week, there was a small hilltop, an outpost called Eviatar. And Eviatar is just north of the Tapuach junction, which is just north of Jerusalem, in quite a challenging area that is often, sadly, prone to flashpoints. It is near Ramallah, if you look on the map. And in response to somebody being murdered in that area, a group of young people said, we're going to go, and our response to murder is to cement our hold on the land. We believe that we haven't tried hard enough. We need to do more to show that we are connected to the land, to the covenant, to God. And you get geopolitics moving in with theology and biblical belief, and it's not going to be pretty. Let's just put it that way. But what they did was they moved onto that hill and they set themselves up with families and caravans. And then over the course of time, there was an understanding that this wasn't the right place or the right time. And you have Naftali Bennett, who is the current prime minister, who is, I think right wing would be a bit of an understatement, right? He's right, center right, but he's a strong advocate for this idea of what's called a greater Israel. And he is in the driving seat when the political decision is taken. We need to tell these families and these people that they have to come off of this land. It's not for now. And in fact, we'll send in the military afterwards just to secure their own military equipment that's there, but everybody else has to leave. And they did, which was, again, it's an extraordinary sense that what you have is somebody who's on the right, who has a long-term view, who says that if this isn't quite the time or the place for this, then maybe specifically that's not the journey to take. But in terms of settlements, the understanding is that they are settlements on land that they said has never been decided. But there are very few other places in the world where you have a war and you manage to expand borders, which happened all the way through history. And now you're spending the next 50 years apologizing for having been successful militarily, and that you can't use that as well. So there is a fantastic new town called Rawabi, which is being set up by the Palestinian Authority in the same, what you would call the disputed territories, what we would call Judea and Samaria, if you're taking more of an orthodox view of these areas, because that's the biblical names of them. And it's being set up beautifully with fantastic infrastructure and schools and buildings. And I think that's a wonderful chance to see that you can build in this way. I think politically it's very difficult to square away from the Palestinian side, because they don't want to be showing a sense of economic prosperity before they've made a political gain in terms of what they feel is a statehood or others. So what happens is that the classic form of, I would call almost an interfaith economic dialogue, which means we'll trade together, we'll work together, we'll build infrastructure together, we'll try and get a sense of how we work together, and we'll become partners, and we'll understand how to live in this area. Those are positive things. The Jewish approach is always, Netanyahu's approach always was economic prosperity first, because once you have enough income and enough of a sense of your own prosperity, you're not going to want to get involved in more extreme political actions, because you just want to enjoy time with your family, as everybody does anywhere in the world at any given point in time. And again, the Jewish approaches or the Israeli approach is to push for that integration. And the Palestinian approach has been seen, and again, you can have this open for a conversation, is at a certain point, there's a very, very distinct glass ceiling. That's not the move we make, because we have more pressing narratives to say that nothing can be done until such time as there is. So the question comes back with this: if you need to move these things forward, then come back to the table and negotiate a better solution going forward. And then that stalls. So it's difficult. It's difficult.
So just to bring it up to the present day, the recent conflict in Gaza, you know, it's certainly been a point of discussion at St. Martin's. You know, people use words like disproportionate, that there are rockets fired, no question, from Gaza into Israel. And then there are more than rockets, you know, there are destruction of blocks of flats in the other direction. It just seems like a disproportionate encounter. How do you reckon with that?
Well, it's challenging sitting here in London trying to figure out what it is. What I do know, and there's a number of elements to this, I think, first of all, is that in terms of ethics, in terms of an army that acts ethically, I genuinely believe, having seen it on the ground firsthand, there is no more ethical army than the IDF. They will send in leaflets and make phone calls, send text messages to people who are in an area which is sitting on a block or in a block of flats, that we have done our intelligence, and we know that underneath, in the basement of these flats, are storage of rockets, missiles. They can give them almost a number or types, pictures if they want, and that therefore this is no longer a safe place to be. There are two options. Either you tell the people who are the handlers to get all of this stuff out because civilians are entitled to live a civilian life. And if there's military infrastructure and you want to have a go militarily at making a point about something I'm not happy with, so then find yourself a base. And if you want to send rockets, you shouldn't be doing that. But it's a military request or a military statement across against another military, and you have two armies fighting on the battlefield in that sense. Understandably, there's going to be flashpoints, but they're military flashpoints. But to then blur and morph and use, I think, a very cynical use of civilian infrastructure to hide military grade means it's very difficult. How do you respond to that? You say, well, as long as there's a school or a hospital that's there and there are missiles around in those areas, what are you supposed to do? Literally, for the love of God, what are you supposed to do to protect all these people? So the number of aborted missions, and again, these are all documented, and the videos come out and the information comes out, and it's documented and sent to all of the military attaches and to the embassies to understand. We wanted to go here, here, and here, but there were children around, there were people around, and you hear abort, do not fire, it's not appropriate. We see people there. We've seen no movement for the last 60 seconds, but I just saw somebody moving in a window. I'm not sure, I'd rather we don't. And then what you have is these huge infrastructure tunnels which are being built, which they're proud to talk about. And it's Hamas. Again, this is an organization that is intent on Israel's destruction. This is not the Palestinian Authority, which, again, from our perspective, isn't pretty. But at least they're trying to figure out some form of engagement in what we would call, the normal language of international functioning and diplomacy. And all you see is tunnels that they say there are hundreds of kilometers of tunnels which are hiding all these things. The last military incursion, as we said, was very quick. And the reason it was quick is because Egypt, I think, was acting as a negotiator, and on both sides they also have challenges from Gaza, have challenges from Israel, but they also want to try. They were seen as a broker who was trusted. The last time in 2014, I think the American administration tried to get involved a little too much and thought they could broker everything rather than leaving people locally on the ground to figure out what was best. That lasted 50-something days. The one here was lasted 11 or 12 days. And the difference was because there was stuff that needed to be achieved to try and stop all of this infrastructure, which was military infrastructure hidden within civilian areas from starting. And Israel is stuck again. The last thing we want to do is send our kids, send our means. And if we've used the last 70 years to develop an air force, a ground force that are some of the best in the world, are we going to be penalized because we're just good at what we're supposed to be doing?
Well,
which is a tough one. It's a
people
tough
just
one.
take the body count. They see that there are dozens of Israeli casualties and there are hundreds of Palestinian casualties.
There are hundreds of thousands, not millions of casualties in Syria. I don't see the rest of the world piling in trying to figure that out as well, including Israel.
Well, it did and didn't do a very good job of that.
Well, I know from first-hand experience that Muslims and people in Syria were taken over the border into Israel, given treatment in Israeli hospitals, sometimes with Israelis not getting as much treatment as their neighbors were getting, in order that they could be looked after, taken care of, and sent back home. Which is, again, how many other countries would send their enemies to the border, knowing that, bar any sort of security challenges, which there are at the same time, they would bring them over in ambulances, take them to hospitals and treat them. This is Israel doing its bit, and this, again, was reported by the BBC a couple of times, but really does go under the radar because it's not the type of story that's fun to tell. And all of the international journalists who want to cover all of that whole Middle East area usually live in Israel because it's a great place to be, and it's easy to cover the stories from Tel Aviv when you're sitting there at in your lobby or in the nice hotel, which is the security that Israel has afforded its own citizens by looking after people as best it can. And it would do anything for anyone around. Just sent a whole group of people to Florida, this terrible collapse of the Surfside a block of flats, and again, just putting people and medical information and supplies on planes and sending them out. Haiti and all places around the world, we do as much as we can, but we're only 9 million people.
So, I mean, looking ahead, 20, 30 years, maybe, I spoke to a rabbi, well, it's been 2 or 3 years ago now, who said, to be honest, I don't know what's Jewish about Israel now. How can a renewal of a profound Jewish identity be a blessing to Palestinians and to Israel's neighbours for all their flaws that you pointed out quite understandably? But where's the hope in this? Particularly, where's the hope coming out of Judaism, which is what we're here to talk about?
Yeah.
Where's the point of renewal?
I think there are extraordinary points of renewal. The trouble is, I believe they're always getting drowned out by a lot of the other things. If you look at the Twitter sphere, you'd think that England was under constant attack, either from the extreme right or the extreme left.
You certainly would.
And the vast majority of the country who are A, keeping to lockdown, B, they're being careful about how they mix with people in public spaces and in private spaces. They're not violating the ideas. They're not seeing family. They're being very careful. Even now, they don't get into the news. What gets into the news are the people who are at the very extremes. And in every country, that is the case. I think there's a lot of excellent work being done in Israel for its own sake. There are a lot of democratic institutes which are trying to align a lot of biblical ideas and theories with modern Hebrew theory, a modern Jewish life. I have a fantastic, it's not here because we're still in our temporary flat, but I have this fantastic journal called Techumin. Techumin means borders, but it's not physical borders, it's conceptual ideas and borders. It stands for Torah. The T in Techumin stands for Torah. The Ch stands for, I think it's Halakha. The Ch comes from that. And also the Min part stands for Medina. So Torah is Torah, Halakha is law, and Medina is state. In other words, over the last 60, 70 years, a very large group of what I would call modern Orthodox rabbis, who are not the ultra-Orthodox, who are engaging with a very, very traditional and quite fundamental view of the Bible. It's not from a reform progressive, which is seeing a much more broad understanding of its general involvement in the world. And I think also by extension has a real challenge with seeing Israel as a place that's trying to grapple with both. Because in a certain sense, religiously, they've also set aside certain parts of the law for a broader understanding of what Judaism adds to the world. And I think it's, as we said in our first discussion, it's the particularity of Judaism and all of its laws and the Orthodox approach that really tries to hold on to this and say this can be integrated into a modern world. And there are essay after essay after essay. It's a halakhic journal, and talking about how we can grapple with a state that's supposed to run while keeping Shabbat. How can you run a state where you can't use any electronic devices for 25 hours, and you have medical, military, state funding, you have power stations, utilities, all these things have to be run. And there are phenomenally ingenious ways to get around some of the precise halakhic challenges that allow us to maintain a keeping of the spiritual and the halakhic, the legal aspects of Judaism, but at the same time engaging in a modern world, talking about loan schemes, talking about how to run countries, how to run the pension funds, and how that fits in with an ethical approach to Jewish law. So they're trying to grapple with the modern state. Remember, the last time they had a state and sovereignty was under King David. So we're a bit out of practice when it comes to what a state looks like. And in King David's time, there was an army, there was welfare, there were many aspects. There was government, there was interaction with the attributes and the powers around. And if you look at the Mesopotamian, or you look at, for example, the Egyptian or the Assyrian narratives, Israel's just this tiny little pain in the behind that's sitting in the middle that either will go with one side or another. It doesn't really feature. From our perspective, obviously, we're the entire feature of the Middle East, but if we're being honest, we're just very small. And that's fine to be very small. But what's happening is there are a lot of good things that are happening. I think there's a lot of study and discussion as to how to make Israel, again, a democracy in a broad area, which even theologically doesn't do democracy. It does theocracy. It does, I don't know whether I want to use the word a tyranny, but it does a very difficult and highly ultra-religious state or economy to try and have that grapple with the modern world. You can either try and push it out and you get a lot of tension, or you try and integrate the two. And Israel, I think, is at the forefront of integrating religion and knowledge and science and politics and putting them all together in a way that can manage and reconcile a religious life with a modern state, with statecraft that's required for international relations and diplomacy and politics by people who are themselves inherently personally religious. And I think that that is a good thing to do, and it's not going to be easy, and it requires a lot of involvement, a lot of time. Again, as I said, 70, 80 years is not a long time to put together all of this thing. But we've been doing it in cities around the world where Jews have been living throughout history. They've figured out how to live a Jewish life within the context of a larger society. We even quote, I think, Jeremiah 29:7, seek the peace and the welfare of the city in which you live. So we do this, and if left to be able to get on with it, we could do a fantastic job, I think, as well. But at the same time, even under all these pressures, international political pressures, some extreme, inappropriate pressures being brought to bear to try and solve a problem in the 20-minute meeting we'll have when all the leaders come together. It's just not viable. We need constant generations of working together, figuring it out. And in terms of the amount of time, he said 20 to 30 years, that only takes us up to 100 years of Israel, which again, is still not a long time.
Early days.
It's early days, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Do you see, I mean, we ought to go to Jonathan's questions. I'm sure he's got several. But
we didn't get to ethical discernment.
We didn't know
that we should try that.
We'll have to do another one.
We'll do another one.
Do you see the fact that Israel is a secular state? Is that a sadness for you? Is that a concession, just a pragmatic concession about what's realistic? Or is it not what you personally would long for?
I think the word secular, when it comes to Judaism, is not the same as secular in other faiths. So there's people who, let's take Theodor Herzl, for example, highly secular, broadly almost assimilated. In fact, he was hanging on by a thread to what you would call, if you sat him down in front of a Jewish court of judges and asked him to give you an understanding of what he had of Jewish law, it would be very limited. But his passion for the people and the need to understand that there is an inherent connection between the people, the land, the tradition, meant that it was the secular Jews who in fact pushed for the need for a Jewish homeland in the modern way. The Orthodox were very happy where they were, knowing that in an ultra-Orthodox sense, there's nothing to be done until God tells us that we're going. The secular is saying, well, if you can't see that God, even if you don't believe in God, is definitely giving you a symbol that something needs to be done. It's the joke about, the man who is drowning in the water and the first comes over a helicopter and he goes, no, I don't need to be saved. I'm waiting for God. And then a ship comes by and they throw a dinghy, the life raft, everything. The man eventually does not make it through these stormy waters, goes up to meet his maker, and he said, what happened? I was holding out for you. And God says, what are you talking about? I sent you a helicopter, sent you a ship, sent you right? So how do you interpret the symbols or signals you're getting for your salvation? And I think that what we're seeing is that we need to figure out the best way to move forward. So it was the secular Jews or Zionists, people who believed Zionism. I think the first Zionist was God. He believed that the place that the Jewish people should be is in the land of Israel. And in fact, Rashi, who is, again, we've talked about this commentator, a very, very early and very well-respected commentator in the 10th century, 10th, 11th century, in his very first comment on the very first verse of Genesis, and you can even find this online in English, he talks about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And his first comment is, as the Talmud says, why don't we start the Torah at Exodus 12, which says, and the first month shall be for you as the head of the months, right? In other words, your first national instruction is to keep time. Why are we giving creation and all of Genesis? What has that got to do with the price of cheese? And Moses and Rashi comes back with his response and says, for the other nations of the world who might say that Israel, by hook or by crook, finagled their way into this part of the world, in order to understand the inherent connection between the covenant promised to Abraham and transmitted through Isaac and through Jacob in the Jewish faith, obviously transmitted somewhat differently in Islam and I think even in Christianity, although they're much more comfortable with that traditional reading, that's why you need to understand that the land of Israel is not just arbitrary. And the connection to God and covenant is not just arbitrary. And so therefore, creation of the world is where it all starts, because that is the beginning of the Jewish story, that creation happens. so that Abraham can happen, so that
Yeah.
his covenant can happen, so that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And from your perspective, you'll just keep going into the next phase.
Well, for me, creation happens so that Jesus can happen. But I guess you would
Right.
say creation happens so that covenant can happen.
So that the ultimate experiment of God on earth happens in the land of Israel, where this place that God says that I will show you. And again, he's not given a place of indicated specifically. It's all very generic. And through Abraham and his children's work, they managed to come to this understanding that that is where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is constantly referenced as the center of the Jewish people. But I think that the secular Zionists were the ones who pushed, because they were pragmatic.
Right.
The very Orthodox were actually sometimes resistant to that because they didn't think it was their time. And over the course of time, the last 70, 80 years, I think, and even more, there's been a sense that there are a modern Orthodox strand that has said, we understand that ultimately Messiah hasn't come yet. Therefore, our ultimate redemption hasn't happened. But we are supposed to be feeling what's called the Atchalta de Geula, which in Aramaic means the beginning of the redemption. That we have been given signs or symbols that certain things have happened which were not even possible remotely in history, in demography. And in that way, these doors have been opened. And the question is, with great, with great opportunity comes great responsibility. And in that sense, what do we do with this newfound responsibility? We do have responsibility for that land and that area. If we offer freedom of worship, if we offer the ability to try and grow a society that's a democracy in and amongst a very, very theocratic, or sometimes sadly still despotic, or those are moving away areas, what can you do with this beacon of democracy in the Middle East? Can it be a force for good? Can it be something that helps all of its citizens to move themselves forward, despite all of the pressures and other things? I think if everybody came to a realistic understanding of where they are and what their responsibilities are to the people around them, including their safety and their security and their progress, and I think we could have a proper conversation. Sadly, I think that's still asymmetric, and that's a real shame. So this is part of our symmetry.
Absolutely. We need to go to...
Okay, Jonathan, we really got into that. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we'll begin with a question from Jean, which is asking for a response from both of you. She starts with the biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, who traced Israel's relationship with land through the lens of the grasp and gift dynamic. The gospel narrative was driven by the dispossessed, but the church is largely a church of material possession now. So how can there be by adequate concern for the poor and the dispossessed in terms of relationship with land?
Wow. Shall I have a go at
Please
that?
do, because I'm a little, you have to explain some of the things to me. What do you mean by, some of the terms are a bit foreign to me.
Yes, I'm not, I know Walter, he's a friend, but I don't know this phrase grasp and gift, I'm afraid. So I'm going to step aside from that. But I guess, when I look at the Old Testament, as I call it, we've got the period when Israel was on the move, and we've got the period when Israel was settled in the land, and then we've got the period again when Israel was in exile, and the period when Israel comes back. And each of those times has their own dynamics, and I think it's hard to look at clearly from a Jewish perspective. The David time was the definitive time. But the scriptures are very clear that those are not without temptations and not without deviations from Torah. I just don't think we can get to what perhaps I've used a strong word, a fantasy imagination of Christian experience by which there is no land. Land is part of our incarnate, our physical condition. And there are plenty of injunctions, whether it's Jeremiah 29 that we were just talking about, seek the welfare of the city in exile, or the language of Isaiah and the return, build vineyards, plant them, flourish in them. It's a perfectly understandable and reasonable thing for people to want to do, to flourish in their land. The important thing is not to take land away from people, but to give everybody that opportunity to flourish in their land, it seems to me. Obviously, that's always a work in progress. The disruption of Jewish history and the disruption of the 20th century in the Holy Land is a painful story. But I don't think, we from my point of view, we need to get to a place where the idea that Jews in Israel can flourish while Palestinians don't, or that Palestinians can flourish while Jews don't, those ideas have both got to be wrong. There's got to be a mutual flourishing, and that has to come through all people having access to land, it seems to me.
So land is an important part. As I said, the inherent connection of the promise of God is of land and of continuation of the people. But Israel, which is, again, I think one of the challenges for other faiths to figure out, is that for such a long time, Israel managed to maintain itself without a land. There are very few, if any, civilizations anywhere in history that have maintained themselves without the ability to have a land. They'd be absorbed to the dominant culture or the dominant religion or the dominant race, whatever that would be. And Israel has defied that for longer than anybody would reasonably think is even possible. Give it 50, 100, 200 years. I think the most extraordinary thing is, never mind even the land, if we're looking at the Inquisition, we're looking at 1492, and the Jews have remained secretly managed to maintain their Judaism for 500 years, which is extraordinary to be able to do that. How do you maintain something without even land, and without even overt practice in 500 years? There's something incredibly strong and powerful that is holding them together. And land, as you said, is the ultimate place where you can have that. Most of the laws in the Bible are primarily connected to land. They are agricultural. The festivals are agricultural. There's a sense of gratitude of the land, the livestock you grow on it, and all of these things are inherently connected to the land. And when there is no land, we still cannot use anything that's been grown on the land of Israel itself, regardless of under whose. And it was, if it's Jerusalem that's been invaded and owned and been used or been owned or conquered 54 times over its history. So, it's seen a fair few people grappling over it.
We need to go to one more question.
That's a challenge, but I think land is important, and we need to. I agree with you that we all need to have a respect and a dignity for the land that allow us to have conversations that are not being had.
And there's an ecological dimension to that as well. Let's take one more, Jonathan.
Okay, so Belinda's asked, there's been talk about economic opportunity as the basis for peace. Do you think that if the Palestinians were given more opportunity to create better economic infrastructures, there would be a better way towards a lasting peace? And she goes on to say, what we hear over here in the UK is that Palestinians are discriminated against, and getting to work to earn a living is one of the hardest things for them to do. So they do not have the same opportunities as the Israelis.
One for you, really.
It is. I think there is a challenge, but I don't think Israel is the cause of the vast majority of those systemic challenges. I think that we need to see an infrastructure being built up within any area, whether it's Gaza, whether it's what you would call the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the disputed territories, however it wants to be defined. That means that infrastructure must be built. That means schools, that means places of not just education, but medical establishments, legal establishments, institutions where you can discuss the ongoing laws and nature of how you're going to manage your country. I think that for an organization which is still in power, such as Hamas, who, again, are not serving the Palestinian people in the best way possible, we need to give them an opportunity to offer them a future that's possible, that's achievable. And for what we see and what we hear, and also knowing the sheer size of financial contribution that's been made from around the world into that area, we're not talking about a very large area or a large number of people. If you take any of the demographic discussions, whether it's 1 million, whether it's 1.5 million, it's not a lot of people in the broader scheme of things. And for the hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, whatever you want to call it, has been plowed into there, there should have been more than enough to build the vast majority of infrastructure, in terms of institutions that are needed desperately by these people to give them a chance to learn, to grow, to accumulate knowledge, to accumulate relationships that can help them to move forward in a modern world. And I only wish that there was a leadership that could help their own people to move forward as much as our own people would help us. And please God, people that are 16 years past their 4-year first election term could really find a place for that second election to happen. That's the reason why everything kicked off a few months ago, by not allowing people the chance to vote freely. Again, these are the real crimes, and it's a terrible shame. And please God, they will find the ability with their faith, with their infrastructure, and with their institutions to find people who can look after them, be the leaders that they're looking for, and offer them a positive future that will help them to engage not just with Israel, but with the entire region.
We've hit 8 o'clock, Jonathan, I think.
Yes. So should we wrap up, or would you like to see another short one?
Yeah. I've got the privilege of going on, having the chance to talk to Daniel after, but we've said this is an hour. I suspect if we don't stop now, we'll still be going at midnight.
I think that's the beauty of what we've been doing, that these conversations are inherently unfinished. And I think our work is always unfinished. And that, to me, is a wonderful opportunity, that it should be always, our conversations and dialogues should always be unfinished. They should be making progress. We should be learning about each other. I've learned a tremendous amount from Sam. I really appreciate the chance to have these conversations. It's moved our friendship forward in ways that I couldn't have imagined just 4 weeks ago. We've had a chance to really grapple with some ideas that we haven't had a chance to before. You've left me with a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts. We're going to have a lot to talk about when we catch up over dinner a little later this evening. But for everybody who's been with us as well, I'll say first, and then Sam will say as well, but it's been a real privilege and an honor to be a part of these conversations. And we thank you for participating in these. And these are definitely by no means concluded conversations. Hopefully we've opened up all sorts of other questions you may not have thought of before, and that we should get a chance wherever you can, find dialogues. And if you don't find them, request them from your churches, from your synagogues. Ask your leaders to get involved in these types of conversations, because they are important, so we get a better understanding of where we are, and more importantly, where we need to go.
Well, I want to thank Rabbi Daniel, especially for his hospitality, for his generosity of heart and mind, also for his sharing of so many thoughts that have been new to me. It's long been my conviction that if you take Judaism out of Christianity, there isn't really any Christianity left. And what that's meant in the last 3 sessions we've had together has really forced me to look at a number of things and work out, if I believe what I've just said, what the Christianity actually is. Those aren't things I've got simple answers to, but it's been an absolute privilege. The kind of, I suppose, to me, the single best thing about this is that the kind of conversation we've just had together, I think, is only possible if you've developed the level of trust that we've developed with each other over the last few years of getting to know each other, and through reading this book together. I just hope this leads to other conversations and relationships of that kind of trust. I hope our trust deepens and our understanding deepens, both in terms of our faith, but also in terms of some of the practical issues in the world, including the one we've been talking about tonight. So I'm very grateful other people have joined in this conversation with the same seriousness, listening, of course, mainly in your case. But do read the book, do read God's Unfailing Word. It's quite a short book. It stimulated quite a lively discussion between us. And as Rabbi Daniel said, I hope there will be other such conversations to look forward to.
Wonderful. Jonathan, wrap us up, sir.
Much thanks to both of you for what have been fascinating conversations across the 3 sessions. There are requests that no doubt we'll discuss for more of these again in the future. But for now, thank you so much, everyone that's joined us, and thank you for everyone that shared comments and questions in the chat. It's been tremendous to have you with us and to share this time together. So thank you all, and hope to see you again soon. All the best.
Thank you very much indeed.